All right, everyone, this is Dr. Jenkins. Here we are for our chapter on tissues. Off we go. So I just want to remind you that we are still building the body. If you remember, chapter 1 was just the introduction and terms, but then chapter 2, we reviewed some of the smallest chemicals in the body, and then we built from that cells in chapter 3, and here we are in chapter 4. Because, after all, cells don't exist by themselves. Groups of cells join together to form a tissue. And that's what this chapter is on. So make sure that you can define tissues. Tissues in the body are groups of cells with similar structure and function. For example, what if we just have a bunch of muscle cells that get together? Well, a bunch of muscle cells that get together is muscle tissue. What if we have a bunch of skin cells that get together? Well, that bunch of skin cells is going to make up skin tissue. All right. There are 4 main types of these tissues in our body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. You don't have to necessarily worry about these functions right now because we're going to be talking much more about each. But these are the 4 main categories of tissue. All right, and of course, this is a carryover with what we're doing in lab. So here in lecture, we're going to just review the characteristics of the tissues, where we find them, what they do. In lab, you're going to actually be looking at them under a microscope. And of course, histology is the study of tissues because histo is the prefix for tissue. All right, good stuff. So, pardon my slide here with Homer Simpson, but this is really important, folks, because tissues make up everything. So as we go through each body system, because by the way, this is our last introductory chapter. After this, from here on out, we're just going body system by body system. Well, with each body system, we're going to be talking about the characteristics of the tissue that makes it up. Because that tissue is specialized to function in that system. So I know it might seem kind of boring and whatever, but we're doing this because the tissues make up everything. And we're going to be coming back to this in each body system. And of course, as we keep saying over and over and over again, the structure matches the function. Why is muscle tissue have some elasticity and ability to contract? Because we need muscles to contract. Why do nerve cells have a synapse? Why do nerve cells have these long axons? Because those are what we need in order to generate a nerve impulse. Okay, and remember, of course, the fact that the structure and function go together is our principle of complementarity. I can't say it enough. All right, pardon me, I just took a sip of my drink here. Okay, so this is something that we skipped in the cell chapter because I really feel like it's more important to talk about it here. It makes more sense to talk about it here. Basically, what we're talking about here is how cells connect. So because groups of cells form tissue, we have to talk about how the cells connect. And there's 3 primary ways that they do that. Let's go through each of them. A tight junction is pretty much when the cells are side by side. I'm going to give you an example, and that would be the cells that line the inside of the GI tract. And you may recall this from lab, because we've probably, by the time you're watching this, we've probably already reviewed it. But here we have simple columnar epithelial tissue, 1 layer of tall cells. Each of these rectangles is a cell, and this would be the nucleus in the middle. But what do you notice? The cells are side by side. They're touching. They're lined up like little soldiers touching side by side. So the example here would be the GI tract. And I suppose if we had to give a function for having a tight junction between the cells, how they connect, if I had to give a function, I would probably say something like forms a boundary. And not to say that that boundary is completely impermeable. If this is the GI tract, well, if it's lining the small intestine, don't we want to be able to absorb nutrients? Well, of course. So when I say form a boundary, it doesn't mean that it's completely impenetrable. It might be semi-permeable. But the idea here is by having the cells side by side, we're forming a membrane, a tight boundary. A tight boundary. And it may let some things through, but really not that many. Okay, the second example of how cells can connect in a tissue would be a desmosome. And if I just go ahead for a moment here, these next slides try and show you that, by the way. So here is the tight junction. So in fact, this is what I was trying to draw, the simple columnar cells. So lining the very top edge of that are cells side by side, right? The pictures here on the left, I don't particularly care for them. I don't think that they do a great job, and that's why I'm drawing it. If you're trying to make sense of this picture on the left, what they're doing is they're showing you this is the boundary of one cell, and this is the boundary of another, meaning that it's tight, right? There's really not that much space in the middle, but that's why I don't particularly care for those. The next thing we're going to talk about is a desmosome, and our example of the desmosome is going to be the stratified squamous that makes up the epidermis or outer layer of the skin. So let me go back, okay? A desmosome. So if we were going to continue with definitions, the cells are close, very close in fact, but have a small space in between, and that small space is filled with protein. Space filled with proteins. So let's just make sure we understand where we are here. And I apologize, my nose is running a little bit. I'm recording this as we're about to enter fall. My apologies. Okay, so in a desmosome, the cells are very close, but they have small spaces in between, and those small spaces in between are filled with proteins. We're going to give the example of the skin, but we're going to be more specific, and it's the epidermis of the skin. So if you remember, the epidermis, and as we're going to review in a moment, the epidermis is made up of many layers of flat-shaped cells. So here are let's do 4 flat-shaped cells, but if it's stratified squamous, it has multiple layers, right? So this is what the stratified squamous, many layers of flat-shaped cells might look like. Instead of the cells being side by side, like the tight junction, they're very close, but there's a little space. And those little spaces are filled with proteins. So the green little lines I'm drawing are trying to represent proteins. If you go back to this picture, if you look at the top here, hopefully you can see the many layers of flat-shaped cells horizontally, but there's little white spaces. That's because the cells are not necessarily touching, and in between those spaces are proteins. So again, in the picture here on the left, this is the boundary of one cell, this is the boundary of another cell, and these blue doodads in the middle are the proteins. The idea here, there's a reason, of course, and the reason is that it gives it some flexibility. but it also helps to distribute tension. So it gives some flexibility, but it helps that tissue to be able to handle some tension. And that's just like the outer surface of your skin. I know you can't see me, but you can follow along. If I pull up on my skin, I mean, it's malleable. I can pull it up and it'll recoil. If anybody's kind of in the clinical world, you know, if you check for turgor, if someone you believe might be dehydrated, what should happen is when I pull up on the skin, it should recoil. If they're dehydrated, it might stay a little deformed for a period of time before recoiling. But in any case, the reason that the skin can be stretched and then recoil is because of these proteins. So it's in areas where we want to be able to have some flexibility and handle some stress. The other example is this cardiac muscle, but I'm going to give you the example of the epidermis of the skin, outer layer of the skin. All right. Our last example of how cells can connect, quote unquote, is a gap junction. As the word suggests, there is a gap. The best example of this, and in fact, you might already be familiar with it, is nervous tissue. So here we have one nerve cell with an axon, and then let's say it's going to come into contact with another nerve cell. Or let's say that the second nerve cell is going to it's going to innervate or supply a muscle. Well, what we notice is there's a gap between one cell and the other. They don't touch. Now, of course, when you look at it under a microscope, you probably can't really see it. Here's our example of the gap junction, okay? If I have, here's one cell body with a long extension. Maybe I'll go to this one. Let's say that this cell body goes to this one, right? Here's cell number 1. Here's nerve cell number 2. The gap would be here. Of course, you can't really see it necessarily, but if we were able, and I'm sure a high power microscope you can, I suppose, if you were able to see, there'd be a gap between the end of one and the other. The function here is all about communication. It might seem inefficient. Why on earth is there a gap? But the reason for this is because we want to be able to send neurotransmitters between. So what we're going to find out later this semester, in fact, is that the end of a neuron will release a neurotransmitter to cross that synapse or gap. Some examples of neurotransmitters are epinephrine, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA. There's so many. And because we can release those neurotransmitters to cross the synapse or gap, we can deliver different messages. Epinephrine might tell the airways to dilate. Acetylcholine tells the muscle to contract. So the idea here is we can release different chemicals when we want different things. And it's only possible because of this gap. It's actually pretty cool. All right, so be able to define each and then give an example. All right, moving on. Okay, so now we're basically going to go through each category of tissues: epithelial, nervous, muscle, connective. Starting with epithelial tissue. So let's start with the main characteristics. In general, not always I suppose, but in general, epithelial tissue tends to cover things. Your skin is an example of epithelial tissue. The inner lining of pretty much every organ is epithelial tissue. So it tends to cover things. We're going to talk more specifically about its functions as we go along. So right now, you can probably leave it at that. As a category, in general, epithelial tissue tends to cover things. Okay, Now with each type of tissue, each category, we're going to talk about its characteristics. So here we go. For epithelial tissue, some of the characteristics that are unique to this tissue. First, free space. Some call it free space, some call it open space. When you look at a slide of epithelial tissue or a picture, down here in the bottom right, for example, there will be some part of the slide or picture that is completely clear or open, meaning there's not tissue or cells covering it. Again, pardon me. Just that time of year, folks. All right, so when you see an epithelial slide or picture, there's going to be an area where there's no cells or no fibers or nothing. Here it's in the middle. Let me just go ahead for a moment to show you some examples of this free space. Sometimes the free space is at the edge. This is an example of your epidermis or outer layer of your skin. And in fact, the outer layer of your skin faces the outer world. So that's what you're looking at up there. My apologies again. Sometimes the free space will appear to be in the middle. In this picture, the free space is in the center of each of these. Here it's in the center of here, at the edge, at the edge, at the edge. Okay. But I want to go ahead because I want to give you some comparison. When we get to connective tissue, for example, it takes up the whole slide or picture. Takes up the whole slide or picture. There's no free space. You're going to have to just kind of listen to me and hopefully just kind of sock that away as a characteristic of epithelial tissue. Excuse me. And then once you start to get more familiar with the tissue types, I think it'll become more clear. So right now, some of it may not be as clear to you, but just kind of sock that away as a characteristic of epithelial tissue. And then once you get more familiar, I think it'll be easier. Okay, let me go back here. So one characteristic of epithelial tissue is it has in it somewhere this free space. Another characteristic of epithelial tissue, usually the cells are joined by tight junctions. Sometimes desmosomes, as the example in the epidermis, the stratified squamous epithelium, but it's usually tight junctions. Usually cells are held together by tight junctions. It is possible to label, for example, the bottom area of an epithelial tissue we tend to call the basal region versus the region of the tissue that faces the free space we tend to call the apical region. But you don't need to know those. You don't need to know those. Aha! So far, what are our characteristics of epithelial tissue? There's going to be some free space. The cells are mostly held together by tight junctions. And this is a very important one. Always, always, always. And by the way, it's not very often we can say always, right? Usually there's an exception here or an exception there, but not here, right? Not in this case. So always, always, always. Underneath the epithelial tissue. So in this slide, from here to here is the epithelial tissue. But one of the characteristics, always, always, underneath the epithelial tissue is connective tissue. They are going together like peas and carrots, peanut butter and jelly. So always, 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 epithelial tissue has connective tissue at its base. That's what connects it to the body. But always, 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 underneath the epithelial tissue is connective tissue. When you're in lab and you're looking for epithelial tissue, you're going to have to look at the area that's facing the free space because underneath the epithelial tissue is the connective tissue. Technically, epithelial tissue itself is avascular, doesn't have its own blood supply, but, the epithelial tissue will get nutrients and its blood supply, let me use the green, epithelial tissue will get its nutrients from the underlying connective tissue. Because of course, epithelial tissue can heal. You get a cut on your skin, it will heal. So of course, the epithelium has access to blood and all that, but it just gets it from the connective tissue underneath. All right. What did I skip here? You don't need to know these as of now. Epithelial tissue is regenerative, as is most tissue, but we're not going to focus on that at the moment. All right, let's get into the epithelial tissue types themselves. We introduced this in lab, but it's always good to review. You know, what's nice about epithelial tissue is the way that it's named makes perfect sense. So, epithelial tissue is named by the number of layers and the shape of the cell. You're going to be responsible for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 epithelial tissue types. Of course, if it is a simple epithelial tissue, it has one layer. If it is a stratified epithelial, it has 2 or more layers. And see, the beauty is that we can start, to do some critical thinking and use our brain. If an epithelial tissue has one layer, in other words, it's thin, probably its function is going to be some type of filtration, absorption, secretion. Because if we want to absorb gases or secrete mucus or filter in the kidneys, if you want to do those things, it makes sense to have a thin layer of tissue because it's easier to diffuse through a thin layer of tissue. Versus, on the other hand, if we have a stratified epithelial tissue, then the function is going to be more of protection. So if we have many, many, many layers, the function is pretty much going to be protection. So, you may choose to memorize each tissue type and their function, but you can also sometimes just think through it. Wait a minute, if it's a simple tissue, the function is probably going to be some type of absorption, filtration, secretion, because it's thin. Or, wait a minute, if it's a stratified, its function is probably going to be protection. And then, of course, we can label epithelium by the shape of the cell. Flat cells are squamous, some say squamous, either one. Column shapes are columnar, and cube or square shapes are cuboidal. Okay, so here we go. We're just going to go tissue by tissue. We're going to give an example of what it looks like, and then give an example of where we find it and its function. Simple squamous, to me, looks like a cracked desert floor. We find it in the lungs. You can memorize different functions if you want, but for our next lecture exam, if I'm going to ask you a question about the location of function, it's going to be on the one that I give you. So for example, if I'm going to ask you a question about the location and function of simple squamous, the location to think about would be lungs, and the function to think about would be gas exchange. Because it makes sense. In the alveoli of the lungs, the air sacs, this is where we're going to move gases into and out of the bloodstream, and it will be diffused through simple squamous epithelial tissue. Simple cuboidal, one place where we find it is in the kidneys. One of the things that the kidneys do is, of course, filters the blood. In this instance, the free space is in the middle, and you want to focus on the cells lining that free space. The cells lining that free space include one layer of cube-shaped cells. You can see it pretty well here. There's one cell, there's another, there's another. So facing the free space is one layer of cube-shaped cells. Good. Simple columnar, one layer of column-shaped cells. One place where we find it is in the GI tract. We're going to be pretty simple. One function is absorption, because one function of the GI tract is absorption of nutrients or water. One layer of column-shaped cells facing the free space. Then we had this little outlier called pseudostratified columnar. In this one, the cells may appear to be stratified, hence the word pseudostratified. It may appear to be stratified only because some nuclei are higher in the cell, in the column-shaped cell, some nuclei are lower. Therefore, it might appear to some that there's two layers, but there's really not. It is really one layer of column-shaped cells. If I go back, of course, wrong one. If I go back, in the simple columnar, the nuclei tend to be in a line. But in the pseudostratified columnar, some nuclei are high, some are low. Okay. But here really are the giveaways for pseudostratified columnar. If you see free space and then that long cilia, if you see free space and long cilia, you're going to think pseudostratified columnar. Now, truth be told, other types of epithelial tissue may have some cilia. If I go back to the simple columnar, if you look really closely, there's little hairs lining some of this, but it's much smaller and less obvious. So other tissues have cilia. But what I'm saying is the pseudostratified columnar will have more obvious cilia. All right, so pseudostratified columnar, free space, obvious cilia. We find it in the trachea. And let's just say it filters, because it filters incoming air, filters out the particulates. All right, good. Stratified squamous, we see the free space on the edge, many, many layers of flat-shaped cells. One place where we find it is the skin, but you're going to have to be more specific. The epidermis of the skin, or outer layer of the skin, because the layer underneath that, the dermis, is made up of connective tissue. Stratified squamous, many layers of flat-shaped cells, free space. We find it in the epidermis of the skin, and of course, because it's stratified, we have a function of protection. It's possible you can hear my cat in the background playing. Good for her, getting her exercise. And I've included just some histology slides to show you. All right. There are other types of epithelium that we're not covering. So in our body, it does exist, stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar. However, you don't need to know it. So you don't need to know these. I just wanted to point out that they exist, but they're rare in our body. We don't have a whole lot of them. So that's why we're not spending time on it. Our last epithelial type that I am asking you to know is transitional. Transitional has the free space and the puffy cells. Free space and puffy cells. Technically, I suppose it's stratified, but this one, we're not really following the rules of the naming. For this one, if you see free space and puffy cells, you're going to think transitional. One place where we find it is in the bladder, and it allows for stretch. Wouldn't the bladder be an organ that we need to stretch? When it fills with urine, it stretches out. This picture here happens to be an empty bladder, So when it's empty, you can see the puffiness is more visible. All right. Okay, we're about to wrap up epithelial tissue and get towards connective, but I just wanted to, couple little last things. You don't need to know the specifics of these glandular things, okay? You don't need to know specifics. However, all I'm pointing out here is that glands, what are some examples of glands in the body? Thyroid, thymus, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal. Well, glands tend to be lined with epithelial cells. Excuse me again, hold on. Of course, my nose just starts to run more when I sit down to record. Murphy's Law, they say. So, pardon me. So all I want you to know is glands are lined with epithelial cells. You don't need to know the specifics. I just like to include some pictures because when we talk about glands, that'll be an A&P2 topic, but when we talk about glands, you will see that the cells that allow for secretion of the glands are epithelial. So I'm talking about these cells right here, right? So all we're saying is epithelial tissue is found lining glands. All right. And lastly, I just wanted to give some clinical examples. You don't need to know this specifically. It really is running. Again, I apologize. You don't need to know these specifically, but I just wanted to give some examples of how this can be useful clinically. So, if we think about a biopsy, what is a biopsy? But you take a sample of tissue and you look at it under a microscope. You're looking to see, does the tissue look like it is supposed to? So it can be a very easy clinical tool. And to be fair, once you know what these tissue types should look like, it really isn't that hard to see when they're looking unwell, right? When they don't look like they're supposed to. So two examples of this would be a pap smear in the ladies. Sometimes I discuss this just because, the men should know about this, really, what the women go through. So that's all I'm saying. So, what they do, men, if you don't know, women go for their yearly exam. They put them on the table, put their feet on the stirrups. And you know what they say, ladies, scoot down, scoot down. They insert the speculum, and then what is a pap smear? But just going in, scraping a sample of the cervix. They're scraping a layer of tissue that lines the cervix, which is epithelial tissue. So they take a sample of that epithelial tissue, make a microscope slide, look under a microscope. Does it look normal? Yes or no? Another example could be an amniocentesis. This is more of a fluid sample taken from a pregnant woman's belly. But indeed, we can take a look at some of the epithelial tissue in that to see if it looks normal. You don't need to know this, but I'm just giving you some examples. All right. So here in this first video, I want to begin connective tissue. We'll see how far we get. And my plan here is to, at a certain period of time, we'll end the first video, and then we'll finish this chapter in a second video, just to break it up a little. So if we think about where we are, we have finished talking about epithelial tissue, and now we're moving on to our second category of tissues, which is connective tissue. Connective tissue is what we have the most of. It's pretty much everywhere, folks. Connective tissue is unlike epithelial in that it doesn't follow nice rules about layers and shapes of cells. Connective tissue can look really different. So in that way, it tends to be more of a challenging type to discuss. There are many, many functions of connective tissues. I wouldn't worry about this now because we are going to be going one by one to talk about its function one by one. Okay. The structure of connective tissue is all over the map. All right, let me just skip ahead. Here's an example of areolar connective tissue. On the left, dense regular connective tissue. On the right, reticular connective tissue. They look really different, folks. So even though we don't have the nice simple naming of shapes of cells and number of layers, there is one way that we can discuss the structure or composition of connective tissue. And that is, no matter what type of connective tissue it is, every connective tissue will have some non-living material and some living material. I think sometimes people tend to overthink this, and we're kind of being simple, right? Every connective tissue is going to have some amount of non-living material, non-living stuff, like fibers or filler. And every connective tissue will have some amount of living stuff. It'll vary in how much of each, but every connective tissue has some of both. The living stuff, the living material, are the cells. And that's not surprising because isn't a tissue made up of cells? Of course. You don't need to know the types of cells here yet. All we're saying is that the living component of our connective tissue is cells. Well then, what makes up the non-living material? The non-living material of connective tissue can include either or both ground substance and fibers. Let's try and make this more simple if we can. It might include some ground substance. I would honestly think of ground substance as easy as filler. It might be a fluid filler. It might include some proteins, but it's just like filler. You know, connective tissue, as the name implies, connective tissue tends to connect things. So we rely on the fact that it has some filler and some oomph to it, right? So ground substance is just like filler, packing peanuts in a box, right? And then there may also be some fibers. Fibers are just what it sounds like, fibers. We have 3 different types of fibers that are possible, and you are going to have to know all of those. So what are examples of fibers? Collagen is an example of a fiber. Everyone has heard of collagen, right? Well, what is it? It's a thick protein fiber. Thick. In this picture here on the bottom right, this is areolar connective tissue. The pink bands here are collagen. They're thick fibers filled with protein. These give a lot of strength to a tissue. Cool. So collagen is an example of a thick fiber for strength. Elastic fibers are thin and flexible, as the name suggests, right? So in this picture of areolar connective tissue, we also have some thin fibers. These are the dark strands. Not only are they thin, but they're elastic. So they give some elasticity to a connective tissue, and we want that. The last example of a fiber type is reticular. The key words for reticular to me are branching. Let me skip ahead because we actually have an entire connective tissue type named after this, reticular connective tissue, because it is made up of these branching fibers. Some people say it looks like a branching tree on a dark, stormy night. This particular tissue type kind of looks like a cherry blossom tree. The cells look like the cherry blossoms. Here are the cells. But what we're pointing out now is the reticular fibers. branching fibers. Some connective tissues will have multiple types of fibers, some will have none, but make sure you review the possible fiber types. And of course, every connective tissue has some non-living material and some living material. The non-living material can include some combination of filler, ground substance, and fibers. And the living material are the cells. My apologies again. All right. So all connective tissue has some living and some non-living. All right. So, let me just go back. There was one thing I wanted to say and I missed it. The degrees of vascularity. I have a slide later on, but I do want to introduce this. Some connective tissues have a great blood supply. Other connective tissues have a not so great blood supply. This is kind of unique to connective tissue. Epithelial tissue has a good blood supply, pretty much everywhere. Muscle tissue, good blood supply, pretty much everywhere. Nervous tissue, good blood supply, pretty much everywhere. But it is connective tissue. Connective tissue, some connective tissues have a great blood supply, some have a very poor. So I'm just going to plant that seed as well. All right. So here are our tissue types. So let's count this out just to give you an idea here. We're going to talk about areolar connective, adipose reticular, dense regular, dense irregular, hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage, bone, and blood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Of the 20 tissue types you have to know, 10, half of them are connective tissues. How about them cookies? How about them apples? All right, some are considered looser connective tissues because they're looser in their composition. Some are called dense because they're denser. So those are pretty simple descriptors, folks. All right, we're going to start with the areolar, adipose, and reticular. These are considered more of our loose connective tissues. Here's what I want to point out. This category of connective tissues has a lot of living components, which are cells, and to a certain extent, less non-living. That's not to say that it has none, it just has less. So this tissue type has a good amount of cells and some non-living material. That's why it's called looser. Generally speaking, the more non-living, the more fibers and ground substance, the denser. Okay, let's go one by one. Our areolar connective tissue. What does it look like? I don't know, folks. To me, it kind of looks like streamers and silly string. So one of my colleagues says it looks like modern art, when they would just throw paint on a canvas, So whatever it looks like to you. This is areolar connective tissue is kind of everywhere, really. Areolar connective tissue, the example I'm going to give is between organs. Yes, it's found under the skin. Yes, it's found around organs, but I'm just trying to pick examples that are easier. So our example that you'll want to review for our next lecture exam for areolar connective tissue is, it is found between organs. And in fact, what's its function? It does wrap and cushion, but this is the truest sense of the word. This is like filler. I give the example of like packing peanuts. If you're mailing something and the box is bigger than, whatever it is you're mailing, you probably want to fill the rest of the box with something to cushion it. So that's kind of what areolar connective tissue is in our body. right? Our organs are here and there and everywhere. We don't just want them to exist kind of separate, flapping in the breeze. So we have some areolar connective tissue between them to help act as a filler, give a little support. Good. Adipose, folks, this is our fat, right? This is one of those types that hopefully once you spend some time with this, or you may already, this is pretty easy to identify. No other tissue type looks like this. It looks like little marshmallows, little gas bubbles. And hopefully you know about adipose. I mean, you probably don't need to even necessarily memorize. Where do we find adipose or fat tissue? In breast tissue, under the skin, between organs. What is its function? Protection, insulation, long-term energy. So you just pick one location and one function. Reticular. This is named for the reticular fibers. No other tissue type is going to have these thick, or relatively thick, these branching fibers, which are reticular fibers, hence the name reticular connective tissue. I mentioned before, some people say this looks like tree branches or like cherry tree blossoms on the tree branches. But as we can see, this loose connective tissue has a lot of cells and also some fibers and filler. Where do we find reticular connective tissue? This is in lymphatic organs, like the spleen. I'm just going to say support. We're going to be pretty general. This tissue type is actually quite stretchy to a certain extent, but it gets that a little bit of stretchiness from the reticular fibers. All right. So those were our loose connective tissues. They were looser, which means that they had a lot of cells and to a certain degree less fibers and ground substance. Well, now we're getting to the dense connective tissues, of which there are two, dense regular and dense irregular. As the name suggests, if it's dense, now we're going to have majorly non-living. So in order to make it so dense, we have a lot of those fibers and ground substance and less cells. Of course, it has to have some cells, otherwise it wouldn't be a tissue, but less. Here's what dense regular connective tissue looks like, and here's what dense irregular connective tissue looks like. Dense regular, look at these thick collagen fibers. What makes this dense regular is that the collagen fibers are parallel. They may be wavy, but the collagen fibers are parallel. Where do we find dense regular connective tissue? One location would be tendons and ligaments. And this time I'm going to be a little bit more specific with the function. This type of connective tissue gives strength in one direction, withstands tensile forces, gives strength in one direction. Basically, it gives strength or withstands tension in whatever direction the collagen fibers are aligned. Cool. Think about tendons and ligaments, how strong they are, right? They hold together bones, ligaments do, right? Well, they get their strength because of these thick collagen fibers. Dense irregular, on the other hand, still has pretty thick collagen fibers, but they're just not parallel to each other. So I'm outlining a collagen fiber, right? But in dense irregular connective tissue, the fibers are not parallel to each other. One place where we find dense irregular is in the dermis of the skin, underneath the epidermis, the dermis of the skin. And this type of tissue can withstand force from many directions. Think about your skin. If I pull it up and let it go, it's going to return no matter which direction I pull it up. Different from the dense regular, that its focus is to provide strength in one direction. The focus of dense irregular is to be able to provide strength from multiple directions. All right. I'm going to end there with this first video, and then we'll come back for part 2.